Welcome. We're here today with Thomas C. Veblen, and he's the author of this book, America's Exceptional Experiment in Self-Governance, Today, Yesterday, and Tomorrow, which is actually sort of a pamphlet, but extremely interesting in the tradition of our founding fathers and the Federalist Papers, published by Dalen Publishing. And we're going to be talking about his writings, and we're also going to be talking about his work as co-chair of the Cosmos Free Thinkers Conversation Table at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. In addition to being a businessman, he's also a Washington insider, I think it's safe to say. I looked him up on Who's Who. Not only is he an agronomist and an expert in agriculture and plant breeding, but in 1965, he joined the Johnson administration as a White House fellow and special assistant to the Secretary of Interior, directed food and agricultural research at the Stanford Research Institute until 1980, and president and founder of Food Systems Associates, trustee of the Freedom from Hunger Foundation, treasurer of the White House Fellows Association, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition, has many business and consulting operations, and has been a member of the Cosmos Club in Washington for many years. And for those of you who aren't from Washington, the Cosmos Club is one of those old, venerable clubs in a big mansion where the worthies of the city gather. And one of the things that makes it kind of special is it has representations from Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. And I think its only official criterion used to be you had to have written a book. There may be others that we can be informed about. And it has many, many Nobel Prize winners. When you go in the door, there's a wall of photos of all the Nobel Prize winners who are members. So it was a club that picked people for their brains rather than their money or their pedigree. There's some other clubs in Washington that are for money and for pedigree. And with that said, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Veblen, who I understand is also a relation of some kind to Thorstein Veblen, inventor of the theory of the leisure class. So there's a genetic element of theory involved here. This book that I reread basically seemed very optimistic about America. And a lot of people feel we're in a very difficult time. And you describe a conflict between basically American individualism and collectivism going on. That's the way you see the conflict today. And you compare it to the Civil War. You compare it to the founding of our nation. You begin with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, who says, the state does not break wills, but softens them, bends them, and directs them. It rarely forces one to act, but constantly opposes itself to one's acting. It does not destroy, it prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. And you have many other quotes and a long list of references of famous books at the end in a bibliography. How do we avoid the fate that Alexis de Tocqueville put forth so many years ago?
I think it's an open question, Larry. The founding of the United States, which I tracked, started actually in 1891 with the establishment of the Bill of Rights and the creation of the individual as an institution in society with full powers and full rights, God-given, not government-given. Radical change in the world. And we've been trying to hang on to that idea ever since. And it was a turning, as Tom Paine said, we would turn the world upside down. Actually, if you track the people who have thought about this deeply and with some intelligence, Tom Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Washington, de Tocqueville, Abraham Lincoln, they all had reservations about whether or not this experiment in self-governance could succeed. It seems that the thrust of the world is toward greater and greater centralization of power and authoritarian rule. The founders of the United States and the nation builders who followed them for the next 150 years broke that pattern. And oddly enough, though the outcome has been awesome and almost unbelievable in terms of even the people who had expectations for the gifts of freedom, somehow human fears and human avoidance of risk results in our looking for some solution to that problem. And in politics, and ends up as authoritarian governance. And we're fighting that as we have been since 1791. So that's where I come out on the sort of context of what we're dealing with here.
All right. Now, in your book, you have several very provocative items. For instance, you have a passenger's guide to getting out alive, which, if it can not be in a ghost form here, which is actually taken, I think, from an Air Canada plane. How to escape basically when your seaplane lands upside down. And stay calm, grab your life preserver, open the exit, release your seatbelt, exit, get to the surface, follow the bubbles to the surface and inflate your life preserver. A lot of people are sort of looking for the life preserver now and the exits in our society. Yet in the end, your book argues that by staying true to the ideals of the American experiment, as you call it, the country can, in fact, not only prevail, but sort of right the seaplane and take off again. Could you explain exactly how that's going to be possible?
I need to back up just a bit, Larry, and put it in context. As you said in your introduction, I trained to be an agriculturist. And I wound up at Oregon State University taking graduate work in genetics and plant breeding. And at that time, as you will recall, there was a great thrust to save India and China from their starvation. And a great breakthrough in plant breeding and the improvement of our agricultural productivity. What I found out at Oregon State was that I was not a scientist, really. To be a scientist, you have to have a humility that just escaped me. And I wound up leaving that field and joining a firm called Cargill Incorporated, which was a grain merchandising company, a global merchant, which exposed me for the first time to business and its full implications. And fortunate for me, I stumbled into one of the world's great businesses, having a Scottish origin and having values that lead to survival in business. And so for 20 years, I was in business. I discovered that I had a unique knack for business problem solving. And that was a discovery on the part of both myself and my employers. And I wound up in Cargill really as a troubleshooter. And by the end of it, I had been elected a vice president in the administrative division and was working to improve Cargill's well-being. I finally discovered, of course, that Cargill is a privately owned company and the family runs it. And that puts a limitation on you for, well, long story short, it led to me going into business consulting, first with Stanford Research, and then establishment of my own firm in Washington, D.C. with the help of a couple of colleagues. So I wound up in Washington actually by accident and out of my normal pattern of life. I'm a Midwesterner, an agronomist, a business person, and fundamentally a conservative risk taker. So I wind up after 20 years of learning business in the consulting field in Washington, D.C., which incidentally voted 96% for Biden. So I'm a bit of a minority figure in this environment. And it's been a revelation to me every day to try to figure out what these people are thinking about and talking about, which actually stimulated me to go back and try to figure out what the code was for American exceptionalism, which I'm told is dead. So how did that happen? That took me back to the founding, to the fundamental decisions that were made in deciding how to create a nation and then how to build one. And by tracing that history, which is rather short in the time frame for great political movements, caused me to think hard about how we got here and what the code was for our American exceptionalism. And that really was what stimulated me to write this little pamphlet, to put down for myself, primarily, what I actually believed was the strength and fundamental principles of success for this remarkable nation that we have. And the title says it all, America's Exceptional Experiments in Self-Governance, because I track back to self-governance, the seeds of our success, of our great success. And I'd be happy to elaborate on that all day long if you'll ask me a couple of good questions.
Okay, well, let me ask you a couple of questions about that self-governance. You say you actually have an interesting illustration here, the American way, which you say is the individual is sovereign, not the state. Change is inevitable and desirable, for it can be ordered by reason to improve the human condition. There's a power greater than ourselves to which we can look for moral guidance. Our purpose as a nation is to advance individual liberty and justice. Our inalienable rights are secured by rule of law. Private property and enterprise are the vital cornerstones of a free and productive society. Government is a necessary evil. Its coercive powers must be constrained. Pragmatism rules. Nature and economics will out. Deal with it. Now, this may be a concise expression of the American way, but a lot of people have been educated in recent years to believe that the founding fathers, as RFK twice slipped and said, instead of saying the framers of the Constitution in interviews I saw him. So subconsciously, he thinks like a person my age, were bad, that they were evil, white, male, rich slave owners. And rather than being revolutionaries against British tyranny who sought to expand freedom step by step, they were just pretending, and the goal of independence from Britain was to extend and preserve slavery around the world. They believe that references to the American way are, bad because they're globalists, they're not nationalists, and anything national is therefore bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you deal with people who don't accept the premises that you offer in your book?
Well, these were men of their time, no question about it. And when they came together, they represented quite a range of, what would you call it? Quite a range of endeavors. But for the most part, they were merchants. I forget what the number is, but it was like 27 or 28 of the people who showed up for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia had a merchant background and were merchant traders as well as being plantation owners. They were men of their times. They were practical. They were informed, interestingly enough, by their uniform Enlightenment educations and by their experience in founding their endeavors in this country, which was pretty primitive in all its infrastructure. One of the unrecognized founders, for the most part, was George Mason, who was fourth in the line of plantation owners, and came to politics reluctantly, was primarily a business person, and probably was one of the signal founders in the arguments for making the compromises that led to the Constitution and the framework that we started our government. It's interesting to me. As an example, the Atlantic 2 years or so ago had a 17-page history of America, which was coincidental with the history put forward by the 1619 Project of the New York Times. And I thought, boy, isn't that great? A 17-page condensation of our history by really remarkable journalists and writers. So I picked it up eagerly to read how we'd gotten there, and I could not find a single reference to business in the entire article. I can't believe it. Here we were founded by business people. We were developed as a nation by business people. And our great success has been that in the initial stage of creating what I would call a merchant republic, business was put in as the spearhead for both our social and economic development. And it stayed that way for 150 years. And today you still see business, though denigrated as you so eloquently put it, emerging to call attention to the problems we have in dealing with our current situation. And of all things, we have a South African immigrant, businessman by the name of Elon Musk, who has set out, in addition to his great business acumen and his genius in that field, to see if he can straighten us out on our principal values. The signal one being our ability to speak freely and openly in society and to exchange our opinions with the assumption that out of that will come an application of reason and new ways to do things. So I'm really intrigued. If you trace back in the history of the United States, you find that business people were involved deeply in the governance of the country, not necessarily as active politicians, but certainly as collaborators with those who took the lead in structuring our government and establishing our systems for governing ourselves. If I would say, people finally started to catch on to the power that business has in creating wealth and us establishing the fundamentals on which you build a nation. Because without the wealth that's either stolen or created, no nation can actually make any headway in the other two elements of nation building, which are national security and citizen well-being. So the key to having a successful nation turns out to be the accumulation of wealth and the wisdom, perhaps, to reinvest it and to put it to good ends. Now that seems to be where we break down in our capacity. The United States did a remarkable job in establishing for itself national security. It had some natural advantages in putting business out in front as the spearhead for creating the wealth that allowed all of our other endeavors to succeed at their tasks. But for some reason, and who knows how we work ourselves through to this third element, where we improve the well-being of our citizens, we have not done a job that would be anywhere comparable with the first two elements of nation building, national security and wealth creation. So we're trying to correct that, I think. The social progressive movement was addressed to that issue and has taken a swerve to the left and now is being actually, the agenda is being set by the left collectivists of the social progressive movement. And what a mistake they make. They don't even understand that wealth has to be created before anything else can happen in a nation.
Well, you did say that you can also get wealth by stealing it. And one of the arguments is traditional history of collectivism is it's basically a system of plunder, whether in the Soviet Union or in China or in Cuba or anywhere they've come to power. They simply take what existing wealth was built up by the previous order and gradually spend it down until they're bankrupt and collapse. China has tried to prevent that by having what some might call left fascism, where they have a corporate interlocking system where the wealth is stolen as it's created on a percentage basis. So business is partners with the government. Let me go into another point you make, American people's cultural strengths, which is 5 points you think America had special. One, endeavor, and you mentioned the term before, and I thought it was interesting because endeavor is a word we don't hear much anymore. Enterprise, industry, speculation, to try, to strive, to make an effort, to do one's best, to struggle, to exert oneself, to undertake, to aim, to aspire, to take a stab at, to have a go, a crack, a whack, or a shot at. Second one you have is purpose, reason, intention, direction, drive. The third is knowledge, knowing, awareness, cognition, grasp, understanding, discernment. Number 4 is self-governance, independence, autonomy, sovereignty, self-mastery, self-control. And fifth is friendship, collaboration, amity, congeniality, sociability, companionability, comradeship, fellowship, conviviality, closeness, harmony, fraternity, alliance, regard, love. I thought that was a very interesting list of the special elements of America because so many of them seem under attack today. I was thinking earlier when you're talking about business people at the founding of our country. Of course, I went to college in Pennsylvania, and one of the most famous founders in Pennsylvania is Benjamin Franklin, who was president of Pennsylvania, although not president of the United States. And of course, he, discovered lightning and electricity. So he was a physicist of sort, like Elon Musk. He was a printer and publisher, Twitter, like Elon Musk. I don't think he had a coach and carriage business, but he was, I think, one of the richest men in Pennsylvania. And of course, George Washington had his distillery business and his farming business, and most importantly of all, a real estate business. At one point, I think he was the largest landowner in the United States, and so forth and so on. So yes, business. But to the collectivists you mentioned, of course, business is the problem, or I would say they would just see it as the cash cow to be milked until it dries up. So how did you pick these 5 points? And one point you didn't mention, which was usually mentioned by people, including myself, as the basis for all the others would be freedom, because without freedom, you can't try. It doesn't matter what your intention is. If you don't have freedom, you can't know anything. You won't be able to govern yourself, and you're not free to pick and choose your friends. So how did you pick those 5? And what about the concept of freedom?
Well, as I said a little earlier, I was trying to crack the code on American exceptionalism. How did this happen? If you look at the results of our activities from, say, 1865, after the Civil War, to 1945, it is a total awesome performance. It's just unbelievable that any group of people on the face of the earth could create that kind of outcome over that period of time. It's just totally remarkable. So what was it that led to that seeming outburst, that remarkable outburst of activity and energy? I agree with you. I think it was freedom. It started out the United States, the founders argued about this. And I think Tom Paine really characterized it in his little pamphlet, The Common Sense, in which they decided, or they reached agreement that for any nation to succeed over time, it had to have a moral compass or a moral purpose. And that's what they set out to do, was to create a structure within which the people could govern themselves by agreeing on a moral purpose. And the moral purpose was individual freedom and justice for all citizens of the nation. And so starting from that base, then the question is, how do you motivate a people to, with that idea front of mind, go about their business and create a life for themselves? The founders, there's no question about it, believed that culture came before politics, and they rested very heavily on the discoveries of the Enlightenment period in France and in England, and mainly in Scotland. We were fortunate that we had a lot of Scots came in the early movement to colonize the United States. and they brought with them this idea of endeavor as the focus of a person's life. And it could be endeavor in business, and that's where I learned the full implications of learning how to accept risk, working with diligence to accomplish a known end, and to spend sufficient time speculating about the future so that you aren't too surprised when things unravel or when things succeed, and dealing with the upside of the downside is what business is all about. So as you start thinking about culture determining the outcomes of a varied group of endeavors through society, from business to music to politics. We're strange in the world. We have independent politics. We have politics aside from government. It's really strange. A novel idea, a radical idea, came about by accident because the founders were a little skeptical about the application of partisanship to politics. And they wrote at some length about their reservations about that. But the facts of the matter are, we have independent politics, independent music, self-governing science, self-governing labor, all the affiliative endeavors of society govern themselves within the framework of a cultural and legal system that assures principally that the individual is sovereign and that the individual is free to pursue whatever endeavor intrigues him. And in fact, I've come to conclude that endeavor is the single best word for describing the culture that carried us through the first 200 years of our existence as a nation. And so if I stand back and I say, how was this structured? We had a national purpose that was overriding individual freedom and justice. We had a culture that celebrated the values that I've prescribed there, endeavor principally, then collaboration, self-governance, knowledge, which goes back to the Greeks who said knowledge is power, and there's no question about that. And then purpose, aim and a drive that carries you beyond yourself and beyond your self-interest. Then the structuring of that was really intriguing. We wound up with people who said we need a commercial society and a rule of law state, a state that was constrained by not only a overarching law, but a common law, undergirded by self-governing affiliative institutions of endeavor. And interestingly enough, of those endeavors that we've specified, music, which is my oldest daughter's, education, which is my middle daughter's endeavor, business, which is my oldest son's endeavor, eleemosynary activity, which is my youngest daughter's endeavor. Those endeavors underpinned the state that was governed by rule of law and commercial society that was headed by business. And so that combination, that sort of structure, allowed application of those values to the endeavors. And we think about business as being signal, and it still is. But my goodness, look at the endeavors that have set the standard in the world: music, the arts, eleemosynary activities. Americans give more of their private wealth to charity and eleemosynary activities than any other people in the world. Remarkable endeavor. Labor, specify all of them, and it is just a remarkable achievement. And I think it tracks back to those 5 values. Not those 5 values alone, but those 5 values seem to me to be the touchstone that permitted us to succeed in all these human endeavors that everybody else flounders in.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that summary. You have a section in your book actually about free thinking at the Cosmos Club,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. I mean, you've given us the theory. My own view is these days, unfortunately, a minority opinion, certainly in the elite, maybe the masses of people are not convinced by their teachers, but yet the Cosmos Club is an elite institution in an elite city with elite membership, and you are a co-chair of a free thinkers roundtable. I just wanted to read a few quotes you put here. Rectify the names. If the names are not correct, if they do not match realities, language has no object. If language is without an object, action becomes impossible, and therefore all human affairs disintegrate, and their management becomes pointless and impossible. Hence, the very first task of a true statesman is to rectify the names. That's from Confucius. How do you find that goes over when you're at one of your meetings?
Read the Lincoln quote first, and then I'll take on
the
your
most
stuff.
reliable way to predict the future is to create it. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. Violence begins where knowledge ends. Abraham Lincoln.
Well, Larry, let me back up a little bit on the Cosmos Club. It's the first club I ever joined. And so it's not my usual pattern of behavior. And I was asked to join the club when I first came to Washington in 1980. And I was traveling so much that I said, Jay, I just can't afford to do that. I just am not available. So finally, in the 1990s, 1995, as a matter of fact, a Cosmos member approached me again and asked me if I would join. And I said, well, I'm slowing down in my travel, and I think I would enjoy interacting with the minds in the Cosmos Club. He said, well, we're going to have to figure out how to get you in. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, you're a business guy, and the Cosmos Club has a prejudice against business people. They think that if you can't do anything else, you do business. And really, you're not a scientist. And he said, how would we get around this difficulty if I'm going to sponsor you? I said, well, I was trained as an agronomist, so I joined the Cosmos Club as an agronomist. Fortunately, I had written some papers on world hunger, which at that time were in vogue, and I joined the Cosmos Club. I was really thrilled to join it. I was intrigued with the integrity of the people in it. with their specialized knowledge. You couldn't sit down at a lunch or a dinner without learning something about a field that you'd never even thought about. And it was most intriguing. And I spent the first 10 years in the Cosmos Club thoroughly enamored with learning about things that I had no idea even existed. Just amazing. And it truly is a collection of people with not only accomplishment in their field, in their endeavor, but a sincere interest in the whole. But as time went on, I found that politically and vocationally, I was really out of step with the organization's principle, which was to bring scientists together. This was their original founding, in a social situation so they could exchange information from their various fields. And I found out, it was impossible to know, but I suppose I was about in the 5% that had any interest in conservative politics. For the most part, my fellow club members, to the extent they thought about politics, were liberals, probably in the classic liberal sense. But certainly there was a good sprinkling of social progressives who had an entirely different view of how the world should be managed than I did. Not to be disturbed, I accepted that, and I thought these are good people in spite of their political beliefs. But then Trump emerged. And of course, there was in Washington a total denigration of this person. Trump, if he's anything else, is a symptom of the failure of Washington, D.C. And I took it as that. I took him as that. And I was surprised and really intrigued with how sensible his ideas were. And of course, I'm not capable of concealing my beliefs. And I found out that I was having a pretty negative reaction by my fellow club members. And my guess was that 95% of them thought Trump was a national disaster. But what was surprising to me was they didn't examine the question of whether this was a symptom of something deeper than they were. How could Trump have been responsible for all this? Well, anyway, there came a time about 2.5 years ago. I was sitting in a meeting where the discussion had turned to the current politics and where they were trending. And a young lady by my terms, I suppose she was 55 or 60 years old, a retired academic, a Russian literature expert, who, when the name of Trump came up in a denigrating way, got to her feet and said, "I rise to defend Mr. Trump. I think he's doing a marvelous job." She was, in effect, told by the chair of the thing to sit down and shut up.
Huh.
And I could not believe it. And so I got to my feet and I said, wait a minute. I think my friend and fellow club member has raised a good question. Is not Trump doing some really interesting things? Let's take, for instance, his work in the Middle East, where he's really extricating us from an impossible situation, and his treatment of the Chinese, which for the first time they're being braced by someone who's calling them for their ill deeds in business and otherwise. I was told to sit down and shut up,
Huh.
in effect. So I did. In the hall later, the lady who stood up and I got to talking about our experience. And we concluded that it was time for the Cosmos Club to have an activity that opened up the discussion for all opinions. And so we said, what are we going to call it? We said, well, we want to do a little free thinking around here. And we want to invite our club members to sit in on our free thinking. And so we called it the Free Thinkers Conversation Table. There was great reservation on the part of the several colleagues that joined us, none of whom had ever expressed a political opinion in the club premise up to that time. They said, well, the board will never approve of something like this. And I said, well, let's find out. And so we drew up a little charter that said we're going to have a free thinking, all club members invited to discuss civic issues and to see if we can somehow enter our opinion into the public dialogue on politics. And they said, well, the board will never approve of that. That's just not with the club's keeping. I said, well, let's find out. I want to know if I'm going to stay a member of this club. And so we put it in and we received sort of an accolade. Somebody said, finally, we're going to have a open debate in the Cosmos Club about the current issues. And that was 2 years ago. We've been operating now for 2 years. Once a month, we come together for 2 hours on a subject that's picked by one of the members. And we hack away at it. We have had, for instance, 2 sessions on education and what's gone wrong with education in the United States. We've had 4 sessions on governance. The first 3, everybody was sort of puzzled why you would talk about governance. And the 4th was just 2 months ago, and really was quite a revelation and quite an opening of membership to the idea of self-governance and what it's meant for the country. So the reason for the little book, Larry, was that when we started on this journey 2 years ago, I decided I better write down what I thought so I would remember what it was. And that was the purpose of this little book, was to document for myself my own views on how the nation built itself over the period of 150 or 200 years, and how it is and why it is we've gone off the rail. Now, one of the interesting things is I shopped this little book around my fellow club members, one of whom is an emeritus professor from the University of California and Los Angeles. He, for 35 years, taught Greek and Roman history. And he read the little book, an earlier version of it, and he said, my goodness, he says, you have really defined the problem. I said, well, that's really, I have? He said, yes. He said, I accept your definition of the problem. He said, the fact that you haven't gotten to do what we should do about it is beside the point. He says, I'm just hopeful the Chinese are really an enemy so we can solve our problems. I said, say that again. He said, well, mostly in the history of mankind, when nations become as far off the track as we've become, it requires an outside enemy for them to marshal their better ideas and return to their principles. And he said, maybe the Chinese can perform that for us. maybe they're the outside influence we need to straighten our thinking inside. And which encouraged me to rewrite the little pamphlet and actually encouraged me to have it published. So that's sort of a long story of what's been going on with us in the Cosmos Club. And I'm really proud of the membership. We're headed for some really good arguments, but I'm pleased that people are prepared to do that.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear that. I wanted to add a quote also from your book on making new knowledge. Where there is much desire to learn, there of necessity will be much arguing, much writing, much opinions. For opinion among good men is but knowledge in the making. And that's John Milton.
Well, I'll tell you the way I think about it. I think Americans have got to start talking to each other. You know, I was raised in a small town, 1,200 people out on the prairie. And as a boy, I watched the town deal with the Great Depression and with the strains and hardship that brought. And in a setting of that size, people are forced to talk about what their problems are. And somehow we have gotten out of the habit of talking to each other and exchanging opinions with the idea of making an improvement in the ideas that we have, because obviously something's gone wrong. There's a general feeling in the country that we've gone off the track, that by God, if we were an airplane or a seaplane, we're upside down underwater and looking for the bubbles. But that's not enough. Once you get to the surface, you got to figure out what to do next. So that's where I think we are. Some of us following the bubbles to the surface, and hopefully once we're up, we can begin to re-examine the situation.
And it seems to me your bottom line is there has to be a return to the original principles that established the United States of America. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart because, you know, there's a whole intellectual debate. This guy, Christopher Caldwell, wrote a book about the Civil Rights Act, and you would know about that as being in the Johnson administration, where, and these are sort of Harvey Mansfield's ideas from Harvard, that, oh, there was a second constitution established. I think he called the book The Age of Entitlement, so that the Civil Rights Constitution superseded the American Constitution. And because of that, everything is now seen as a civil rights issue, but a very special light, because civil rights no longer means equal rights for every citizen, which is the original meaning, but it's been converted into some other justification for overturning all the rights in the Constitution in the pursuit of basically what he would say is or what you might call a collectivist progressive goal. And I'm guessing what you're suggesting is, in this little book, if we go back to the original principles and try and get back on track, not only metaphorically, but really, that might be one solution. And the only way to figure it out is to have open discussion and the free exchange of ideas, which is the opposite of the trend we've seen towards censorship, especially among the elites who have been busy using big business to ban, suppress, censor, etc. I mean, I had one of my YouTube interviews, I hope they don't take this one down, banned, and then they put a strike against me for Bob Knight, Robert Knight, who's a columnist for the Washington Times, talking about one of his columns about a subject they had on their list that you can't talk about, which I didn't even know, because I thought if you're talking about an article in the newspaper with the author asking him to explain it, I wasn't making any claim myself. But in any case, I was very struck by the way that censorship was done to me, which seemed un-American, unbelievable, and sort of Chinese style, because they never told you exactly what it was. The appeal was with an anonymous person who you never had the answer, and they denied it, and you didn't know it. No evidence was ever given. And then they said there's a strike against you, and if you get 3 strikes, your channel will be banned, and they'll delete everything I posted. And it's like, that had a chilling effect. I put up less for a long time. And originally, I had bought stock in YouTube when it first went public prior to Google, thinking this is a great thing. It's an open forum. Anyone can post. It's just what we need. And I saw it with the cooperation of big business. And this is why I hope you're right that businessmen aren't all on board with this censorship thing. They started taking down things that had lots of followers. I mean, I had no followers, but people with huge followings were banned, and just because they didn't like what they were saying. And that struck me as the Chinese censorship model rather than anything in American principles. So I think you're right. And I think it's in, you've pointed out some very important, I'm delighted that at the Cosmos Club in the capital of the United States, there's a little group that are acting just like the Constitutional Convention and arguing about things. So I congratulate you, and I'm grateful to you, and I salute you for your service, as they say. So thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would. I told you I have discovered, and it really was a discovery, that I have a knack for business problem solving. And I don't know where that came from. I don't know why I have it. Some people have a knack for playing pianos, and some people have a knack for writing novels, and they can't explain it. You can't explain it, but how many people would you go pay money to listen to them play a piano? Very few. Lots of piano players, but only a couple, 3 that will turn us out. Same is true in business. And I wound up, I had a knack for that. And as I've thought back over what it is, first of all, we have a tendency to overthink the problems. Secondly, to solve a problem, you first have to define it. And once you've defined it rightly, and you will usually be surprised at where you wind up when you set out to define a problem. If you've defined it rightly, the problem normally solves itself. It's really intriguing. And it's a social activity, which it turns out, that Benjamin Franklin said this, 2 heads are better than 1. So through social action, you can come up with your unique ways of describing a problem that normally results in it being solved. And so that's where I've been in my thinking, was that if I could take the natural knack I had for business and apply it on a national scale, I might be able to come up with a problem statement that would suggest the solution all by itself. Well, turns out running a country is a whole lot more difficult than running a business. And I think I'm making progress in moving toward a reasonable solution. In fact, I'm in the process. I have a book designer, and we're making a new edition of the book, and it'll be published in Amazon probably in October or November. And then the next question is what to do about it. And I'm hopeful that by focusing and directing attention to thinking through what the problem is and defining it rightly, that we can come up with some solutions collectively, collaboratively, socially, that would solve our problem. And I think you're exactly right, that it's getting back to the principles that underlie our amazing success. And those principles are pretty much common sense and enlightenment informed, in my view. And I'd like to argue that with anyone who cares to step to the stage. I've had the same experience that you've had, Larry, that people who are attacking the experiment in self-governance refuse to state their objectives and their purposes. They do not want to talk about them. All they want to talk about is your failings and your shortcomings. And we know them better than they do. So now we should get at it. I'd say one more thing. I do believe there are three things for creating a successful nation, and they are national security, wealth creation, and citizen well-being. And that we've been so concentrated on the first two for our history that we've not put our good and best thoughts to work on citizen well-being. And we've got a lot of work to do in that area. And socialism is always seems like the logical solution, and it isn't. Because as you say, it takes the money and spends it to bad ends and doesn't reinvest it. So that's where I am with this little project, and I'm really pleased that you picked up on it, and I'm really intrigued with what you found in the little book, and it encourages me to press on.
Well, I'm just delighted that anybody is, especially in a hostile environment like Washington, D.C. I lived there for 30 years, and I was astounded, honestly, that the degree of conformity and complete lack of intellectual curiosity that was sort of dominant there, especially in the more recent times. And it was actually, to me, it was like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or something. I saw people who I thought were normal people just sort of going like this, you know, and anything you can do to bring us back to common sense, which was Tom Paine's title, is much, much appreciated. And God bless you. And I hope your work continues to go from strength to strength, and that your little group maybe can be like, I know there's a lot of debate about Oppenheimer, but like his Manhattan, well, not Manhattan, the bomb project, actually. And you know, the Cosmos Club could be like Los Alamos, which, you know, they just were sitting around a table. You can come up with some ideal. And you said you were part of the Green Revolution. That has changed the whole world. When I was growing up, it never occurred to me that China and India would be exporters of food. Even to this day, it strikes me as unbelievable when I get a package of rice and it says product of India. Because when I was growing up, they were all starving. So it shows that all these things can be changed, both through technology and science, but also through changes in social structure, because they changed, India especially changed how it was governed. So anyway, thank you very much. I think with that, we'll wrap it up, and hopefully look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
What a pleasure. Thank you, Larry. Enjoyed it very much. You do a great job of pulling people's minds out.